The South African Reserve Bank periodically upgrades banknotes to protect the value and security of our currency. The latest key changes are the big five animals appear as a family on the back of each banknote. The watermark portrait on each banknote will be of an animal. The color-changing security thread has a dynamic movement effect when tilted. A spinning circle feature at the bottom right of each banknote, and improved accessibility features for the blind and partially sighted, including raised printing on the edges of each banknote and enhanced colors. The upgraded banknotes maintain the same denominations, sizes, and dominant colors as the existing banknote series. All banknotes issued by the SARB remain legal tender and retain their respective face value, irrespective of the issue date. The latest upgraded banknotes will be used together with the banknotes already in circulation. The SARB does not demonetize its currency. The South African Reserve Bank has issued its fourth decimal coin series. The key changes are a Cape Honeybee on the 10-cent coin, a Bitter Aloe on the 20-cent coin, a Neisner Tarako on the 50-cent coin, a King Protea on the 1 Rand coin, with the South African flag on the obverse side, a Springbok on the 2 Rand coin, and a Southern Right Whale on the 5 Rand coin, with a hidden image displaying the words Rand and 5. The new coin series retains the same value as the coin currently in circulation, and will co-circulate with the previous coin series.
And we'll be talking about our new banknotes. We are also open to hearing anything that you would like us to pass on, because we also meet with our colleagues from the rest of government. So if there are other things that you'd like to raise with us, we'd very much welcome that from yourself. So today, maybe just to highlight the format that we're going to have. I've got a number of colleagues with me. So I'm Fundi Chazibana. I am one of the deputy governors at the South African Reserve Bank. And joining me are colleagues from the research department of the South African Reserve Bank, from the currency department of the South African Reserve Bank, and also our stakeholder management and communications teams. So on the team with me, it's Rowan on my right. And on my left is Mokhabiso and Dineo. And right in front of me, and they will have to get up so that you see them, are Thorea, who's from communications, and Joel, who's from currency. So that is who we are today from the South African Reserve Bank. Part of the work that I do at the Reserve Bank, in addition to being in the Monetary Policy Committee, is to look after banks and insurance. So if you've got any questions about banks and insurance, you're also welcome to ask those questions. Also, just to remind you that part of the work that we do also in the South African Reserve Bank is to look after the national payment system. So just making sure that card payments are possible, payment transfers are possible. Happy to talk to you about some of that work as well.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mokhabiso Tsinkeng. So our presentation today is based on the Monetary Policy Review that was published on the 23rd of April this year. And it basically covers domestic and international developments that affect monetary policy stance. So to start us off, I'm going to be taking us through the primary mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, or the SARB. So as stipulated in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, the SARB is mandated to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. So in order to protect the value of the currency, The SARB is responsible for price stability, which ensures, as far as possible, that inflation is maintained within a 3% to 6% target range. So to carry out this mandate, we have the Monetary Policy Committee that meet every 2 months to set the repo rate. And part of the Monetary Policy Committee, we have Governor Lesitja Kganyago, and then we have Deputy Governor and CEO of the Prudential Authority, Fundi Chazibana, who's here with us today. And then we have Deputy Governor Rashad Kasim, Deputy Governor Kuben Naidu, as well as the head of the Economic Research Department, Chris Luvald. So just to provide an overview of our presentation, global inflation remains elevated and is persistent. At the same time, global growth has remained weak, especially in the last 2 years, and the growth outlook remains muted. In response to elevated inflation, central banks, especially in advanced economies, have raised policy rates markedly higher. Domestically, growth continues to be underpinned by structural constraints like load shedding, which we're all very familiar with. Despite this, though, there are some sectors that have remained resilient and continue to contribute positively to growth, such as household spending, as well as private sector investment. Given the robust growth in private sector investment as well as household spending, and notwithstanding some production side constraints, imports are up, and that has caused the current account to be back in deficit, and we expect it to remain there. On inflation, we are of the view that inflation peaked last year when it reached 7.8% in July, and it has moderated over the last 6 months. But as we've seen from recent data releases, we are still on a long journey to reaching the 4.5% midpoint target of the 3 to 6% target range, and risks to this remain on the upside. So now I will go into a bit more detail, starting us off with our view on global inflation and global growth. So on the left, we have global inflation, which has remained elevated, but there are indications that it peaked in the second half of last year. On the right, we have our measure of global growth, looking at our trading partners. If you focus on the blue bars, you can see that in 2022, trading partner growth was weak relative to the 2010 to 2019 average, and it is expected to remain weak over the medium term, although a slight pickup is projected in 2024. If you pay attention to the red line, which is the IMS forecast, this is also aligned with our view. So all of this is concerning because the combination of high global inflation as well as low global growth indicates that global stagflationary conditions have indeed entrenched. So just to delve a bit deeper into headline inflation, on the left-hand side chart here, we have major advanced economy headline inflation, and we can see that it has remained elevated. But as I mentioned earlier, there are indications that it has peaked, and this is mainly on account of lower food and oil prices. Taking it a step further, we see that core inflation is actually what's remained elevated, both in advanced economies and in some emerging markets. So this is concerning because core inflation moves a lot slower than headline inflation, which is more volatile as it is affected by oil and food prices. So in response to elevated inflation, central banks have had to increase policy rates. If you look on the left-hand side chart, you can see that policy rates in major advanced economies have increased quite significantly, with the earliest hiking cycle beginning in the latter part of 2021. On the right, we have the same for emerging markets, where we see policy rates rising quite significantly, but maybe less so for India. Okay, so the combination of high interest rates as well as high inflation has exerted a lot of pressure on growth and growth outlook. So if you look here on the left-hand side, we've got advanced economies, and on the right, we've got emerging markets. And you can see for both that the growth outlook remains fragile. Those short red lines are the pre-COVID-19 GDP growth average, and the outlook for the medium term remains below that. If you look at the USA, for example, the UK, for example, China, Russia. So the story is the same for both, where the growth outlook is fragile over the medium term. Now looking at the South African economy, the growth outlook in South Africa is also weak, but that's for slightly different reasons than what we saw in the global section. But I will get into more details in the next few slides. On the right, we see that the Free State contributes about 5% to global to GDP, with the agriculture economy, with agriculture central to its economy. Sorry, slides are. Yeah, it's stuck. Okay, there. So that slide is what I was talking about, where I was talking about the forecast for domestic growth, which is weak. I will get into the reasons a bit later. And on the right there, we see that how much the Free State contributes to national GDP. So because of some challenges that are facing the South African economy, real GDP growth over the medium term, as well as potential growth, have been reduced quite markedly. And this is mainly because of some structural constraints, like load shedding. So on the left, if you look at that red section, that's total unplanned outages, and those have increased quite significantly, especially in the last year. And the blue line, which is coming down, that's the electricity availability factor. So basically, we have inadequate electricity to support economic activity in the country. On the right, logistical constraints are another reason why real GDP growth over the medium term, as well as potential growth, have been downgraded. So over the last decade or so, rail infrastructure has deteriorated, and as a result, more freight has been moved from rail to road. But the problem with that is that it puts a lot of pressure on road infrastructure. It's actually rail infrastructure that's better suited to transport heavy bulk goods, especially over long distances. So you can see, the switch there to road from rail because of rail inefficiencies. Looking ahead, our forecast for load shedding is as follows. So in 2022, we had 157 days of load shedding. And as at April this year, we already had 108 days of load shedding. And this is just 4 months in. So for the full 2023 year, we are expecting around 250 days of load shedding, but there could be more, especially with higher intensity. On the right, we have estimated direct impact of load shedding on GDP. So the sub-estimates show that in 2022, load shedding alone shaved off about 0.7 percentage points from growth. And this is expected to worsen in 2023, with sub-estimates show a 2 percentage point drop in GDP just from load shedding. However, there are some green shoots from the demand side of the economy. So on the left-hand side chart, we have gross fixed capital formation or investment. And here, private sector investment was the largest contributor to overall investment in 2022, which allowed for a 4.7% increase for the full year. Looking ahead into the medium term, gross fixed capital formation is expected to remain positive, although it has declined somewhat. And this is mainly on account of load shedding mitigation measures that businesses are taking, as well as energy reforms that we expect to kick in. On the right, we also expect households to continue to spend. And this is mainly So we expect households to continue to spend, and this is mainly because of credit demand, which has remained strong, as well as employment, which has recovered, especially in the last few quarters. So we expect that to continue to provide some support. However, there are some signs of pressure on households, especially when you consider spending on non-durable goods. And this is mainly because real disposable income has come down, although it is still in positive territory. So looking again at the expenditure side of the economy, if you consider the left-hand side chart and pay attention to that green line, so that's gross domestic product. And you can see that after the pandemic, it increased quite significantly. So production was strong. But then we started to experience some production side challenges and production started to decline. But demand remained strong. So here we see there that expenditure is significantly higher than production. So that gap is filled by imports. So that, combined with the fact that commodity prices are declining, you'll see on the next slide that it has put pressure on external current accounts. So here on external accounts, so here on the left-hand side chart, you can see that the trade balance, which is the red bars, has declined, and the current account balance, which is that black line, is in negative territory, and we expect it to remain in deficit for the medium term. At the same time, there's also pressure on the exchange rate. Here on the right-hand side, you can see that the exchange rate depreciated quite significantly, and it is expected to continue to depreciate over the medium term. So this is problematic because the exchange rate, when the exchange rate depreciates, it puts upward pressure on inflation via the exchange rate pass-through channel. And that is actually one of the contributors to the elevated inflation that we're actually seeing domestically. I will now hand over to Dineo, who will take us who give us more detail on what's happening with inflation.
Evening, everyone. So I'll be taking you through the inflation section of the presentation. So our domestic inflation remains elevated and has been persistent in remaining above the upper end of the target band. And most of these pressures, we see them from both the core inflation as well as the non-core inflation. So upward pressures from food and the core inflation are expected to be with us for this year and only ease going into next year. Thus, even headline inflation is expected to only moderate by the end of 2024 at 4.5%. Now, if we zoom into the non-core inflation, we see that food inflation has accelerated sharply from last year, with the latest March outcome at 14%. Now, looking at the contribution chart on the left to food inflation, we see that increases have been broad-based across the food CPI basket, with some food items accelerating more than others. And we see this largely on food components such as bread and cereals, vegetables, milk, cheese, and eggs, as well as other foods. So initially, the increase was driven by spillover effects from the high fuel prices that we observed last year. Recent increases, to some extent, can be attributed to load shedding. So, for instance, the milk, cheese, and egg component, shown on the graph on the right, we see how it has accelerated from April last year. And that's mainly because the poultry industry had to cull a lot of chickens due to load shedding. And therefore, that resulted in less egg supplies and therefore raising the prices of eggs. However, we do note that domestic factors are not the only factors that are driving food prices. And this we also note that global effects are also playing a part, and this we see on the next slide. So the more depreciated exchange rate has contributed to the high inflation. The graph on the left shows the global food prices against the rand-denominated global food prices, and we see that the green line, which is the rand-denominated global food prices, are higher, therefore reflecting the effects of the exchange rate depreciation. And this trend is likely to continue as the rand continues to remain weak in the near term. On the right, we see that though food inflation appears to have peaked in the first quarter of this year, there is still some uncertainty as upside risks remain. And again, we see that we've consistently been surprised on the upside when it comes to food inflation in each MPC round. So initially what happened is that we were surprised on the upside as a result of the Russia and the Ukraine war, which we saw that it reduced food supplies and also raised petrol prices, which therefore resulted in higher food prices. And that gap we see when we look at the difference between the yellow and the blue line. But then load shedding happened, and now we're seeing that food prices even jumped higher, to the red line, which is above the blue line. So now moving over to core inflation. So core inflation, we see it rising, but it does so on a steadily pace, and we see that it's rising from the lows of the time of the pandemic. The upward pressures on core inflation are coming from both the core goods as well as services inflation, but we largely see core goods showing a more elevated trend, and that's mainly because of the exchange rate depreciation that we continue to see. While services inflation is rising, but more steadily, and it's because the big components of services inflation are starting to normalize towards their pre-COVID levels. Now, if we unpack core inflation, starting with core goods, so we see that core goods inflation is driven by both the global as well as the domestic factors. So on the global front, we have seen imported inflation coming in from the foreign goods inflation, shown on the first graph, so which is also keeping domestic core goods inflation elevated. So in addition to that, we are also seeing the significantly depreciated exchange rate also playing a role in keeping core goods inflation high, and that is shown by the middle graph. So on the graph, we see that some of the exchange rate sensitive items within the core goods basket have been rising in tandem with the core goods inflation, and this trend is expected to continue as the rand remains weak. And the last graph is just showing how spending has relatively been subdued on these imported goods, such as furniture, appliances, computers, as well as transport equipment, and that's because of the increase that we see in prices for those goods. Now, when we look into services inflation, so services inflation, as I mentioned earlier, is rising, but at a more steadily pace. So the graph on the left is showing that there are some upside pressures on overall services inflation, as we see that the share of services items that are growing above the 4.5% has gone up, while those that are growing below the 4.5% are starting to decline. And these pressures are also evident when we look at the graph on the right. So from the graph on the right, we see that the big weighted items of services inflation, which is your medical insurance, your housing inflation, have started to pick up from the lows of what we saw during the time of the pandemic. And this is mainly because now these items are starting to normalize, to go back to where they were before the COVID time. So they're going back to their pre-COVID levels. However, we do note that the housing inflation, which accounts, I think, 32% of services, seems to be moving at a slower pace than the rest, therefore keeping the overall services inflation a bit muted. While the restaurants and hotels inflation is peaking, is rising, and it's mainly rising on the pickup in tourism as well as the higher food prices that we continue to observe. So upside risks to inflation remain, and this is over and above what we have penciled in our baseline. And in the next few slides, we talk to these risks. So we note that inflation expectations have been rising, and though that is clearly visible on the graph on the left, where the 2-year ahead inflation expectations are rising, and we see them remaining well above the 4.5 target midpoint, with the possibilities of even breaching the 6%, which is the upper end of the target band. Meanwhile, on the right, we see that the distribution of the 2-year ahead business inflation expectations shows that inflation has been expected to remain above the 4.5% recently. And we see that the 2022 distribution is showing that inflation was expected to be higher, largely being between 5 and 6%. So these inflation expectations outcomes are a risk to inflation as they are considered in the price setting process by price setters. Another big risk that we talk to on the next slide. So various articles do show that many businesses have had to resort to alternative sources of power, such as diesel generators, in order to remain operational during the load shed hours. And this, for many, has presented high variable costs for them, with some citing that they've seen additional increases in their total electricity cost of about 35%. So this additional cost is likely to be passed on to consumers, therefore adding inflationary pressures. So the impact of load shedding on inflation is expected to be significant and is expected to be felt across the CPI basket, so therefore affecting food prices, affecting core goods as well as services inflation. So given that inflation has consistently come out higher than expected, with heightened upside risks, we see on the next slide that the MPC was then required to raise rates in order to fight inflation and in order to keep it under control. So the repo rate was raised since the November 2021 MPC. The repo rate has been raised by 475 basis points and currently sits at 7.75%. And our internal model is suggesting that the repo will reach 7% by the end of 2025. So in conclusion then, we have seen that from the global front, global inflation is high and persistent, and we are seeing some spillover effects onto our domestic economy. On the growth front, we see that global growth remains subdued on tighter financial conditions, and the weaker growth has prompted questions of whether central banks will stop with their rate hiking cycles. And then on our domestic front, we see that medium-term growth is expected to remain weak, largely due to load shedding. While on the inflation side, headline inflation is expected to remain elevated for longer on high and very sticky food and core inflation. Lastly, we see that, we note that the repo rate has been raised by the MPC to fight inflation. But despite this, we see that inflation pressures may persist. And this is largely visible from the risks of higher inflation expectations as well as the load shedding effects. That is all from us. Thank you.
Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the governor mentioned, my name is Joel Durugia. I am from the Currency Management Department at the SA Reserve Bank. One of my key areas of responsibility is the management of currency protection devices, as well as all matters pertaining to die stain technology. For today, I've got the platform to talk to you about our banknotes and coin, as well as the upgraded banknotes and coin that you would have seen in the public domain now. So just as a very high-level background, we at the South African Reserve Bank, we periodically upgrade our banknotes and coin. So this is done in accordance to best practices, best international practices, and it's to ensure that we protect, preserve, and maintain our currency. We also ensure that we upgrade the security features to ensure that we maintain public trust in our money. In 2012, we introduced the Mandela banknotes. So these are the banknotes that you and I should be seeing in our pockets every day. Subsequent to that, in 2018, we thereafter introduced the Mandela Centenary banknotes, and this was to commemorate our former president, Nelson Mandela. Generally, banknotes are upgraded every 8 to 10 years, and coin less frequent. But we'll talk about the upgrade in the next slide. So what's new? Majority of you would have seen that last week the governor announced that there's upgraded currency in South Africa. So we kept the themes the same. So we still have the Nelson Mandela as the main portrait, the main motive, and the secondary portrait would be still our big five banknotes. The denomination matrix still remains the same. So we still have the 10, 20, 50, 100, and 200 Rand. In terms of the banknote paper, the substrate, it still remains the same, as well as the sizes and the dimensions. As we continue to celebrate our constitutional democracy, we have now introduced the preamble to the South African Constitution in microtext. So this can be found to the left and the right of the main portrait of Nelson Mandela. We've also introduced the country's flag, the South African flag, and you would now see that on the back of the banknotes, we have the big five animals, but this is now in a family unit, as opposed to just a single animal on the previous banknote. So we know, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of people also struggled with differentiating between the 200 and the 20. So we've upgraded and we've enhanced the colors on the banknotes. So your 200 is now a more vibrant orange, and your 50 Rand is now a purple color. We've also consulted with the relevant institutions for the blind and the visually impaired, and we've incorporated tactile marks on the banknotes, and this is to ensure that our visually impaired and blind communities can also identify with our banknotes. I am going to play a short video for you just to introduce the banknotes.
The South African Reserve Bank periodically upgrades banknotes to protect the value and security of our currency. The latest key changes are the big five animals appear as a family on the back of each banknote. The watermark portrait on each banknote will be of an animal. The color-changing security thread has a dynamic movement effect when tilted. A spinning circle feature at the bottom right of each banknote, and improved accessibility features for the blind and partially sighted, including raised printing on the edges of each banknote and enhanced colors. The upgraded banknotes maintain the same denominations, sizes, and dominant colors as the existing banknote series. All banknotes issued by the SARB remain legal tender and retain their respective face value, irrespective of the issue date. The latest upgraded banknotes will be used together with the banknotes already in circulation. The SARB does not demonetize its currency.
So, colleagues, as mentioned, we have never demonetized currency. So, the existing banknotes that you have is going to co-circulate with the upgraded banknotes. I'm going to talk about the coin quickly. In terms of the coin, we've also upgraded the coin to the 4th decimal coin series. The theme we've considered is what we call deep ecology. Now, this considers humankind as an integral part of its environment. We've kept the design elements mostly the same and familiar to you and I, such as the colors of the coins and the the metallic makeup of the coins. The denomination matrices are the same. We have the 10 cent, the 20 cent, 50 cents, 1 rand, 2 rand, and 5 rand. In terms of the front of the banknote or of the coin, or what we call the obverse, you would find the year the coin was minted, as well as the word South Africa written in all 11 official languages. On the 1 rand coin, on the new 1 rand coin, you would see that it now depicts the coat of arms. Well, from the coat of arms, it now depicts the national flag. I'm going to play a short video on the coin.
The South African Reserve Bank has issued its fourth decimal coin series. The key changes are a Cape Honeybee on the 10-cent coin, a bitter aloe on the 20-cent coin, a nice Morocco on the 50-cent coin, a King Protea on the 1 rand coin, with the South African flag on the obverse side, a springbok on the 2 rand coin, and a southern right whale on the 5 rand coin, with a king image displaying the words rand and 5. The new coin series retains the same value as the coin currently in circulation and will co-circulate with the previous coin series.
So similar to banknotes, the coin will co-circulate with the existing coins in circulation, and they maintain their face value. These are circulation coins. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, for more information on our banknotes and coin, I implore you to please download our sub-currency app. Now, the sub-currency app is a very nice tool to have. You can access all of these videos as well as information on our security features on both the banknotes and coin. It is available on the Google Play Store as well as the Apple iStore. And if you are experiencing challenges, our colleagues are outside to assist you with getting this app downloaded. In conclusion, if you have any inquiries, you may direct them to us at www.resbank.co.za. We do have a contact us page where you are able to reach us directly. Or alternatively, you may send us an email at currency@resbank.co.za. I thank you.
Thanks, Fundi. I think you covered just about everything, but I will embellish a little bit. And I think just to start off on the Eskom and the rail logistics and the problems we face there, and to talk about, moving everything to air, as Fundi said, most of what can go by air does go by air. Some of our minerals, if you look at precious metals like gold and the PGMs, rhodium, etc., that gets transported by air. But it's really tough to take bulk metals like iron ore and coal as a mineral and transport that even on road. So, it's impossible to take it by air, but it's really tough to take it even on road. And that's one of the reasons why our roads look like they do in Mpumalanga, is because of so many coal trucks running. And part of that problem, as we know, is the cable theft on that Mpumalanga line. But just to sort of change direction, South Africa being a commodity exporter, and a lot of it is on the minerals and on the metal side, has really been fortunate, with everything that has gone negative post the COVID restriction period, has been fortunate that commodity prices did as well as they did. And on top of that, we had a depreciated rand, and that has really supported exports. Now, on the volume side, exports have been flat, pretty much tracking, mining production. And it's really those prices that have helped us. But the point is, getting to the logistics side, we need rail in this country. And I think most people that, really look into the logistics side Rail is a very, very efficient way of transporting things. So it's just something else that most of us know about, like load shedding. You know, we need to improve the efficiencies of how these state-owned organizations are run. You know, we have to improve governance, etc. And it's as Fundi says, you know, maybe we've been too cryptic in how we've actually spelt that out. But it's clearly things that need to be fixed. And you need to have the right leadership in these organizations and at the municipal level. I mean, we talk about the municipalities and everything that's really gone bad. And I think post the COVID period, it's just dramatically worsened. But yes, so that's, you know, and just to give you an example on the coal export side, if you look at volumes going through the Richards Bay Harbour, 70 million tonnes on average over a number of years, dropped off in last year to around 50-odd million tonnes. So a significant drop. So imagine with the coal price where it was last year at a time, almost touching $400 a tonne, how much better our economy would have done, you know, through the export side and then in turn through the fiscus and the revenue that really, you know, that's the one place government collected revenue was from that side. Okay, so enough said about that. That's just going into a little bit of detail there. On the admin prices, I think if we had to look at admin prices, excluding the basic fuel price component, which isn't a true admin price, it's the fuel taxes and margins that are. Most of our admin prices are running above the upper target level over the last 15 years. You know, there's been some movement around. Things like water have stayed at 10% over the last 15 years. So, you know, the whole admin price situation is something that the bank really has in its focus, because if we take admin prices now, say at 10% as an example, other inflation would be running at about 6% to get to the 7% headline inflation that we have. So just to show you how much admin prices are adding to inflation. And we are focused on that. Done a lot of research, and we are speaking to the different organs of government around that. Yes, inflation is bad. I mean, inflation targeting is really proven over the last 20, 30 years to be the only way. And I mean, if you take inflation of 15%, 10 Rand becomes 180 Rand in 20 years' time. If inflation is 4.5%, that 10 Rand is only around 20 Rand in 20 years' time. So just to give you that idea, you know, of how inflation erodes purchasing power. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything. But yes, I think Fundi covered most of it.
Firstly, regarding the 10 cent, the need, why do we still need the 10 cents? I'll story with you. Today I was actually in the communities. It was Rocklands in Bloemfontein. The 10 cent is still very much used in circulation, up to a point where that maybe you and I are not using it in our pockets, but we reached a point where we ran out of 10 and 20 cents, and we needed to mint more for our communities. So it's still very much part of our economy. In terms of the question for the feature for the visually impaired and the blind, I'd like to quickly invite the gentleman from the Office of the Premier to come up to the stage. I'd like to demonstrate this to you. Please, thank you. So whilst we're waiting for the gentleman, ladies and gentlemen, I've got the Mandela banknotes that we are all familiar with, and as well as the upgraded banknotes. So on the Mandela 2012 banknotes, we have what we called tactile marks. Now on the short edge of the banknote, you will be able to firstly observe the lines, and now I want you to run your finger across, and you will feel high raised frontal. Can you feel it?
Making it happen. You must tell us.
You need to tell us.
Yes, I can feel.
Can you feel? So on the 10 Rand, we have one line, which means it's a 10 Rand. On a 20 Rand, we have 2 lines. On a 50 Rand, we have 3. On a 100, we have 4. And on the 200, we have 5. So that's how the blind people can actually identify with these banknotes. On the upgraded banknotes, we've incorporated some more features in consultation with the relevant association. So you see, similar to the version, the previous version, you may feel the tactile marks on the edges,
Yes, yes.
as well as on the top of the.
Yes.
So what actually happens here now, ladies and gentlemen, there is a slight change. So as opposed to the previous where they counted the lines, now they count the visually impaired or the blind, they count the gaps in between the lines. So on the 10 and 20, it's on the short edge on both sides of the banknote. So on the 10, there is 1 gap. On the 20, there is 2 gaps. On the 50, 100, and 200, there are higher denominations. So what we've got here now, we've got to turn to the long edge of the banknote. So on the 50, it's 1 gap again. The 100, we've got 2 gaps. And on the 200, we've got 3 gaps. In addition to counting the gaps, we've catered for the visually impaired. So for the visually impaired, we have what we call geometric shapes at the bottom edge of the banknote. So the partially sighted can have a look at a 10 Rand and you'll see a diamond shape. On the 20 Rand, we've got a square. On the 100, on the 50, we've got a circle. On the 100, we've got a hexagon. And on the 200, we've got an oval shape. And the last feature that we've included in addition for them is what we call large numerals. Now we know that some of us are nearsighted and some of us are farsighted when it comes to reading. So you'll notice on the banknotes that the denomination numeral is printed as a big number and a small number. Thank you.
Central TV.